So, hello, welcome back. Again, my name is Jonathan Gay. I'm an attorney with Addiction Recovery Care. And today we are going to do class 2 of the War on Drugs for our emerging peer support academy. If you'll recall, last week we focused on the long view of addiction and abuse. We went all the way back to ancient China and ancient Rome. We talked about how there are essentially 8 fundamental laws that we see and in play anytime we have the wars on addiction and drugs. And so we went over those some detail. We're going to go over those again today in a lot more detail. And we covered all the way up until the start of the 20th century. This week, we're going to talk about 20th century. And the 20th century is when things really get going for addiction and abuse. Unfortunately, societies were becoming much more urbanized. Drugs were becoming much more readily available. You had manufacturing improvements, chemical improvements. When I say improvements, I don't mean that necessarily in a kind way, but nonetheless, we saw that. And we also see the globalization. So we see drugs that are made in other places suddenly available in, say, the United States and of course, other areas, but we're focused on the United States. So let me go ahead and pull up our slideshow. Let's see, share screen. Okay. All right. Share. Okay. So slideshow. Again, always, no matter how many times I do this, struggle with the transition. So, okay, here we go. Again, this is PSS 108, and this is an elective for our Peer Sport Academy. If for some reason you stumble on this on the web, it's open, it's out there because I want to share this. I'm a big fan of putting my message out there, and if folks disagree, then please feel free to disagree and let me know where I may be wrong, and hopefully we can learn from that. So this week, we're going to study 2 things in depth. We're going to study prohibition, which is, of course, an absolute ban on alcoholic beverages. And we're going to talk about the war on drugs in the United States, primarily America's bid to stop cocaine, heroin, and opiates. I think those are the 3 biggies after we get past prohibition. My dog has something to say, but we're not going to give her a platform. Okay, so review. We talked about 8 fundamental rules of drug and alcohol abuse and addiction and how those interplay into the wars on drugs. So first, addiction and abuse is ever present and it spares no one, particularly when it accelerates and permeates society as it has in America over the past 100, 120 years. Secondly, government constantly steps in and attempts to stop it. The problem is, as we talked about last week, is it gets to rule number 3, governments are not very precise in curtailing this kind of behavior. They try with many different policies, but they have always struggled. To the extent that they've been very successful, it's usually because they've been very draconian and they've stifled rights and they've harmed a lot of people, and maybe you take the China and the Singapore example of throwing people in prison for very low-level possession. I'm not sure if those policies even work, but certainly they don't work in the United States. So it brings us to number 4. No matter what government does to try to stop drug abuse, we are constantly seeing innovation at play. We're constantly seeing manufacturing and improvement in the development of drugs. Fifthly, globalization plays a key role. What we see in the United States is globalization and drug abuse on steroids. Drugs are constantly coming into the United States, and they're constantly finding their way into every nook and cranny in society, no matter where they may have originated. Number 6, we talked about the Native American experience last week, and I'm going to hopefully bring that home for you today to talk about some other constituencies. But from the Native American experience, we saw that addiction did not hit everyone the same. Native American society was absolutely ravaged by alcohol abuse in the 18th, 17th, and 16th century, even though it didn't affect the Europeans to that same degree. You had a lot of abuse of alcohol among European societies, but you did not see the level of destruction that you saw in the Native American societies. So we're going to talk about how drug abuse is something, while it's permeates every nook and cranny in society, it doesn't affect everyone the same. It hits some constituencies much, much harder. Number 7, the private sector. It's one thing about the United States. The United States is a huge, huge marketplace, if you will. And there's always lots going on. There's always lots of merchants out there. There's always lots of organizations out there trying to do various things, a lot of things that are good and great in society. And then you have organizations that are working for not so good purposes. You have organizations working for evil purposes. So that's something that we see in a very big way in the United States, particularly in the 20th century, is that private sector really explodes. And we're going to talk about that some. And finally, we come to number 8, the moral activist. Drug addiction is not simply a personal decision. It is not simply something that's going to be isolated to a family or a community. It's something that is going to eventually offend people, even if they're not directly impacted by it. And they're going to do what they can do to get the federal government or the state government to increase jail sentences, to criminalize drugs, to ensure that people are not out abusing drugs to the extent that people in addiction might like. So the moral activist and the moral activism is a huge factor in the war on drugs, and we're going to talk about that. So that's a review of our 8 rules. So let me summarize Prohibition. First, Prohibition did not happen overnight. We all know that Prohibition happened in the early 1900s, and in fact began in 1920. But it had a long windup. In the 1830s, we began seeing the first temperance movements, and they advocated for abstinence. In 1847, Maine's Total Abstinence Society convinced government to pass a 15-gallon law, and it banned the sale of alcohol in amounts smaller than 15 gallons. Then in 1851, Maine, again, very progressive state over the centuries, bans the production and sale of alcohol. The law includes an exemption for medicinal purposes. 1855, 12 other states had joined Maine in banning production and sale of alcoholic beverages, but it would ebb and it would flow. You would have these laws that would be passed, and then later they'd be rescinded or they wouldn't be enforced. By 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded. This group argued that banning alcohol will help reduce spousal abuse and other domestic problems. So there we start looking at not only moral activism, but the fact that alcohol has become such a problem that it's impacting innocent people. And those innocent people in turn are becoming activists and are being represented by other activists trying to ban alcohol. Later, the WCTU will focus on other social issues, including public health and prostitution. And they'll even work to promote women's suffrage. In fact, we won't talk about this at any kind of length today, but something that you see in studying Prohibition is Prohibition and women's suffrage, which is the right for women to vote, went hand in hand. And the reason for that is the women's movement recognized that not only was it crucial for women to get the right to vote, another thing that was ailing women in the 19th century was the fact that they didn't have a say, they didn't have so they didn't have the right to vote, and they didn't have freedom at home. They had they went home to men who were often quite abusive if they were intoxicated, and so that was the reason that these women organizations got involved in promoting Prohibition. 1893, Anti-Saloon League formed in Oberlin, Ohio. Within 2 years, this group becomes an influential national organization lobbying for Prohibition. Today, it survives as the American Council on Alcohol Problems. So some of these organizations that advocated Prohibition still are alive today. So Prohibition summarized. Now we get to the 20th century. 1900 to the 1930s. In 1917, the United States Senate passed the Volstead Act. That was one of the first significant steps towards the passage of the 18th Amendment. This banned intoxicating beverages that had alcohol greater than 0.5%. In 1919, January, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified by 36 states. Although the amendment bans the production, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages, it does not actually outlaw their consumption. And the reason for that is they probably felt that that would be unconstitutional. October 28th, U.S. Congress passes the Volstead Act, and it establishes guidelines for the enforcement of prohibition. The law goes into effect on January 17th, 1990. Set my internet box. It's notifying me. 1920s, with the passage of prohibition, a huge black market develops around the country. The darker side of that includes gangs of bootleggers led by figures such as Al Capone, the boss of an organized crime syndicate in Chicago. 1929, Prohibition agent Elliot Ness begins in earnest to tackle violators of Prohibition, including Al Capone's gang in Chicago. Difficult task. Capone will ultimately be arrested and prosecuted for tax evasion in 1931. So the federal government couldn't actually get their arms around Capone for bootlegging. Instead, they got him for tax evasion. So another sign of how governments really struggle to ultimately stop and curtail trafficking of any kind of drug that it deems illegal. So Prohibition summarized Act 3. We see Prohibition fading, believe it or not much more than a decade later. In 1932, Herbert Hoover accepts GOP presidential nomination. He discusses the ills of Prohibition and the need for its end. It was legislation that was very much championed by the Republican Party 12 years earlier. The Republican Party represented a lot of rural states, whereas the Democratic Party represented a lot of urban constituencies and a lot of immigrants who were not too keen on the idea of prohibition. 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democratic winner of the 1932 presidential election, signs into law a measure that would legalize the manufacture, sale of certain alcoholic products. Support for prohibition continues fading. Many call for its removal. And in February, Congress proposes an amendment to the Constitution that would end prohibition, that was ultimately ratified in December of that year. Hat tip to Martin Kelly with thoughtco.com for the Prohibition era timeline. Worthy of mention. So talked about organized crime. Organized crime grew in a huge way in the wake of Prohibition. What we saw is these gangs were able to and willing to satisfy people's desire to drink. They didn't care about the penalties. They accepted going to jail as part of the price that they would have to pay to do this kind of work. Many of them were poorer immigrants who came from very marginal, impoverished societies. They came from Sicily and places where things were certainly much more difficult than they were in the United States. And so they were willing to go to prison. They were willing to even sacrifice their life and be loyal to one another. So we saw the rise of organized crime in a huge way, and it is still with us today. We saw extreme measures on the part of the federal government to try and enforce the ban on alcohol. And it got so bad that the federal government actually advocated and permitted poisoning of alcoholic beverages to try and get people to stop drinking. So ultimately it didn't work. But I wanted to hit on a few of our 8 laws of addiction at work during the Prohibition era. So first we talk about rule number 1, addiction spares no one. And we see that here. We see families, we see innocents broken up and broken down by alcohol. And this is a cartoon from that era, and it says, "What will save the home?" And you see in these various snips of the cartoon, you see the woman and the family coming to the man who's not able to work. And then the woman is in the next slide, bad employment rather, for women and for children. So the man is drunk at home, and the women are having to work, and the children are even having to work. And then it goes on to the third snip, and the third section, if you will, is the easiest way. And I had to look that up to be certain what it was that they were saying, but it seems to be an allusion to prostitution. And so this is again a PR piece to try and advocate for prohibition, to try and advocate for the right to vote for women, and alcohol features in a big way in this message. A couple of other cartoons from this era, and let me move my slide over so you can see this third one, and we'll start with the third one. So the third one, so remember what's happening in the late 1910s. It's World War I, and what we see is America's at war with Germany. Many of the people who are selling alcoholic beverages in the United States are German-owned companies, and so you see booze marching in this cartoon. The Hun, which is a reference to Germans, the Hun Rule Association. We make people poor. We are against progress. We cause poverty and crime. And so all these things that the cartoonist is trying to convince you that the manufacturers and the distributors of alcohol are responsible for. And oh, by the way, they're German. And oh, by the way, guess who we're at war with now in 1917 and 1916? We're at war with the Germans. So if we really want to fight the Germans, and we don't want to just tie one hand behind their back, then we have to go after their organizations in the United States. And their organizations in the United States include the alcoholic beverage makers and distributors. So that was a message that you saw that was very effective. In fact, a lot of people think that had it not been for World War I, we probably would have never seen prohibition. I talk about the private sector and how the private sector grows and shapes the contours of addiction, both for good and for bad. And so you see a cartoon here, Bulletproof. This is from the Chicago Daily Tribune, 1926. And law enforcement is shooting at organized crime, and organized crime is basically sitting back and just laughing while they fire their empty bullets at them. So another example, I think, of how the private sector comes into play anytime you have drug wars. Finally, the first slide, in this case that we're going to talk about last, is the cartoon of Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was originally from Gary County, Kentucky, and moved to Kansas. And Carrie Nation would walk into saloons armed with a hatchet and would begin chopping all the different hoses and all the different brass pieces and the casks themselves that contained alcohol, the kegs. And she would literally do that until she was arrested, and in a way to bring attention to the plight of families suffering from addiction. So the moral activists are very much on display during the Prohibition, probably more so than you see in the later 20th century, because by the later 20th century, they pushed for so many reforms that now the machinery is in place, and they no longer have to go out and take a hatchet to a heroin lab or a meth lab. All they have to do is appeal to the federal government and local law enforcement to add these banned substances, to their list of banned substances, and then you'll see law enforcement go after them in a big way. But you still will talk about later in this show, we'll talk about how moral activism continues to be a huge factor in the wars on drugs. You just don't necessarily see someone as colorful as Carrie Nation. Again, continuing on down the list. So with Prohibition, these are our 8 rules. Innovation and manufacturing. And I stole a slide from a little later, a picture from a little later in the century, but I thought that this would really illustrate to you, what do we have that really proliferates in the era of Prohibition. We have illegal manufacture of distilled spirits, moonshining, if you will. Those of us from Eastern Kentucky are usually quite familiar with that. So innovation and manufacturing go hand in hand. You see people don't necessarily stop using drugs just because the federal government says they're illegal, just because the federal government is willing to arrest people. They still try to find a way, whether it's repurposing legal products such as medicinal whiskey or manufacturing products illegally, such as corn whiskey or moonshine. Um, another slide another image that really brings home one of the rules that we talked about in the wars on drugs. I talked about the fact that governments fail and flail. Governments try really hard to eradicate drug abuse, and they come at it with a big stick, but it's sort of like this farmer here. He's swatting at rum runners, he's swatting at bootleggers, but you see they're scurrying hither and thither, and occasionally he gets a good lick in, but he never really achieves what it is that he's trying to accomplish. He's never able to totally tame these animals because the horse is already out of the barn. Moving over to this other slide, and it's kind of a interesting slide, I think, interesting image. Will you marry me? Sure. And this is Prohibition marrying the American public, and the American public supposedly had their mind on war, and they weren't really thinking about it. And so then 7 years later, they're married, and there's no getting back. There's no divorce in this marriage. And so that was the way a lot of people felt about Prohibition. They felt that Prohibition was a marriage that America entered into that just didn't work, and they were stuck with it for a lot of years. And I'm not trying to ultimately say that Prohibition was good or bad. That's not my purpose to advocate for. What I'm trying to show you is that it doesn't necessarily work. And that brings us to what it is that you're trying to do, which is attack addiction from the source. These laws help. I'm an attorney, trust me, they help, because they've helped me get clients and get people that I care for into treatment in a way that simply asking them pretty please would never have worked. And you guys are probably testaments to that. Your lives and your experience in addiction are probably a testament to that. You don't just go in when you feel bad. You don't go in because it's destroyed your life. You go in because a deputy hauls you into jail and says you either stay in this jail cell or you go to treatment. But what I am trying to get across to you is that we've got to focus on addiction from the standpoint of attacking it with the addict, by arming the addict with the kinds of tools they need to ultimately stay sober. That's the way we'll win whatever war on drugs that we ultimately fight. So government failed to eradicate alcohol, and because of that, they surrendered on Prohibition, which brings us to the war on drugs. And we're going to talk about, again, primarily methamphetamine, opiates, and narcotics. So moving on down the list, Prohibition sets the tone. What we saw is federal intervention and leadership in a big way. We saw the professionalization of law enforcement. I mentioned Elliot Ness. We saw the FBI rise to its level of being able to be a national organization to go out and arrest people. In 1914, we saw the Harrison Act, which regulated and taxed opiates. 1919, we saw Webb versus United States, and that was a seminal decision by the United States Supreme Court that basically held that if a physician is simply writing scripts for opium to the addict and they don't have a legitimate medical purpose, their only purpose is to sustain the addict in his or her habit, then that is not an allowable use of their physician's license, and it allowed the federal government to prosecute them. That was a critical act. In 1937, we saw the Marijuana Tax Act, and that was the way it was literally spelled in that particular act. So we saw more and more legislation be added on, but Prohibition really set the tone, and it allowed government to create the apparatus that was ultimately and later used to, I won't say great success, but that was used in a very significant way over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century. 1940s and 50s, we saw the war on drugs was primarily relegated to urban areas, and it was a cosmopolitan problem. It was something that you saw in Chicago and Cincinnati and Detroit and New York. It wasn't necessarily something that you saw in small town America, but the mafia were stepping in and they were accelerating trafficking. But there were a lot of societal changes that were at work that would totally blow the door open on drug use and drug abuse beginning in the 60s. So 1960s, we saw the crest of a wave of unrest. This is actually from the DEA's webpage, and this is the history of the DEA. Was founded in the 70s, but this is a history of the war on drugs before the DEA and some of the other narcotics agencies. And so the mid-60s witnessed the crest of a wave of unrest. Cities overflowed into suburbs and schools overflowed into streets where the flower children grew and the greening of America left a mold of drugs and crime. It was partly a matter of sheer numbers. As the post-war baby boom arrived, few knew what to make of its consequences. There was also a boom in the number of drugs. A Pandora's box of mixed blessings, some good, some bad, had been opened by the pharmaceutical industry. Stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, and any number of pacifiers promising a chemical solution to life. Narcotics addiction was rumored to be endemic among U.S. troops in Vietnam, and at home, drugs were exchanged by the young like potent watchwords of protest. Going back to that reference to veterans, I was reading last night on Nixon declaring the war on drugs, the formal war on drugs, and one of the things Nixon talked about was how Vietnam veterans were getting hooked on drugs. Soldiers in Vietnam were getting hooked on drugs while they were overseas, and how that was a critical factor in Nixon's war on drugs. Alienation became a vogue word to explain the yawning of the generation gap. So younger people felt estranged from their elders and felt the need to retreat into drug abuse. While children eyed their parents with increasing distrust, the parents looked to their government, demanding an instant solution to the drug problem. And of course, as we all know, there is no such thing as an instant solution to the drug problem. So moving on down the line, we come into contact with Barry Goldwater, and then we see LBJ and Richard Nixon. Barry Goldwater ran for president of the United States in 1964, partly on a campaign slamming crime in the states. Although Goldwater didn't necessarily come very close to winning, the issues that he talked about were ultimately co-opted by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who did win that election. In 1965, LBJ created the National Crime Commission. He declared war on crime and federal resources to states to fight crime. So you start to see that machinery that I referenced earlier in the episode really begin to take shape. You know, Prohibition had kind of created a model, but now in the 1960s, they're growing these models out and they're becoming much bigger and much more powerful. And they're designed to get resources and get leadership and get professionalization and even militarization into our law enforcement agencies to try and fight the scourge of drugs. In 1971, Richard Nixon made it official. He said drugs were now America's public enemy number one. Keep in mind at the time, we had the Soviet Union, we had China, we had the Vietnam War, and yet Nixon said that drugs were America's public enemy number one, and he declared a war on drugs. Interestingly enough, not something that is widely discussed, he also plugged the need for rehab. He said in that statement that he sent to Congress asking for funds to fight this war on drugs that he declared, that, quote, we must rehabilitate the drug user if we are to eliminate drug abuse and all the antisocial activities that flow from abuse. The financial cost of addiction are more than $2 billion every year. Keep in mind, that's 50 years ago in just a few months. The financial cost of addiction, more than $2 billion every year, 50 years ago. But these costs can at least be measured. Again, quoting Nixon, the human cost cannot. American society should not be required to bear either cost. Despite the fact that drug addiction destroys lives, destroys families, and destroys communities, we're still not moving fast enough to meet the problem in an effective way. So that was Richard Nixon in 1971, declaring the war on drugs. Nixon also signed into law the Controlled Substances Act. So any of you that have either yourself or had friends that have been arrested for drugs will have come into contact with that Controlled Substance Act because you've seen Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 drugs. The Controlled Substances Act is where those different taxonomies got their start. So Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush and Obama. I'm going to breeze through this. In 1980, Ronald Reagan's wife, the first lady, gets involved in the war on drugs. And she says, just say no, made that her signature issue. We see sentencing guidelines. We see mandatory minimums. So we're doing all we can to try and stop the scourge of addiction. 1988, President George H.W. Bush, a vast increase on drug war budgets, even invades Panama and takes out one of the world's largest drug traffickers, the leader of the country of Panama. 1992, Bill Clinton, Southern conservative Democratic governor, wins the presidency, promoted the crime bill in 1994 that increased the trend toward mandatory minimum, 3 strikes laws. 3 strikes you're out. So mandatory minimum, for those of you that may not know, is where in the federal government you have a certain amount of cocaine, you have a certain amount of heroin, and it automatically brings with it a floor sentence. So it may be 2 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be. Most of the cases that I've dealt with over the years have been in state court. So you see the same thing play out in state courts. If it's over a certain threshold, it becomes a Class C felony or a Class B felony. In 2000, George W. Bush. George W. Bush begins to turn things around a little bit. He begins to be the president who's a little more sympathetic to the addict. He was, of course, a Republican president, so he didn't have to take the same hardline positions that maybe Democratic President Bill Clinton did. But George W. Bush was also someone who was very strong in the faith community. He was a very evangelical president. And before that, he'd been sort of a bad boy. In fact, a DUI conviction came out in the closing days of the campaign, and a lot of people feel like it probably cost George W. Bush the popular vote in that election. Bush, even at one point, was pinned down on whether he'd ever used cocaine, and he sort of took a non-answer out of that question and said, you know, when I was young and irresponsible, I did things that were young and irresponsible. But he began to put a little more human face on addiction, and he pointed to his own faith in helping him overcome an alcohol addiction. So in 2008, we see President Obama. And what President Obama did, again, a Democratic president who had to watch very carefully that he not be pegged as too liberal or too soft on crime. But what Obama did is he began to mute the war on drugs rhetoric that you'd seen in the years gone by. He began treating addiction as a public health issue. He even used the power of pardons, particularly in the African-American community, to pardon people who were convicted of rather low-level drug trafficking or drug possession charges. In 2016, President Trump came along, and President Trump was very supportive of treatment over the years. Of course, he balanced that with tough rhetoric against trafficking and the war on drugs. But one of the things that President Trump did in the closing days of the election campaign against Joe Biden was really slam Joe Biden's role in the 94 crime bill and talked about how it impacted the African-American community with the mandatory sentencing guidelines. So what we've seen over the decades is the presidents have become a little more liberal on the war on drugs. So now we're going to apply the 8 rules. So again, the 8 rules recap. Addiction and abuse ever present. It spares no one. It spares no family. Number 2, governments constantly step in to try and stop addiction and abuse. And number 3, they constantly and continually flail and fail. It's just not something that they've been able to achieve, no matter how many billions of dollars of resources that they're at it, no matter how much they've incarcerated people over the years, no matter how much they've made drugs illegal. They just keep creeping into our communities. Number 4, manufacturing and innovation is constant. Number 5, globalization plays a key role. So traffic from other countries is critical in drug abuse. Number 6, the Native American experience is a reminder that addiction doesn't hit everyone the same. Number 7, private sector. Drugs are a huge business. Stopping the supply of drugs is nearly impossible, but we also see people come into the private sector in a good way. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, number 8, moral activist and activism. So jumping in, I'm going to take the first 2, ever present and spares no one. I want you to just here consider your own experiences, consider your own families, consider your friends and your families. You know, we've got a fella, and I won't mention his name here on this episode, but he jokes, and he said it in public a lot. He says, you know, when I was growing up and when I was in my days of addiction, I would go out and I would use with people who are now judges and now physicians. And at the time, maybe they were in medical school and they were in law school, and they would go home and they would be able to function, whereas I would go home and I would have to steal from my grandmother. And he says it in a much more eloquent way than I just did. But the point is the same, and that is, you know, we see abuse proliferate, we see addiction seep into families. Consider your own friends, consider people that you would have never thought would ever be hooked on drugs now are. Maybe you're in that category. Maybe you came from a family where addiction was never something that you would have imagined that you fell into, but you fell into it. That's what we've seen over the decades with drugs. Governments constantly step in and try to stop it. There are police in every single community in America trained on high alert for drug trafficking, for drug abuse. And then we get to number 3. Despite that, despite the fact that there are law enforcement officers everywhere, whether it's in Alaska or Southern Florida or Southern California, Texas, Maine, New York, whatever community you go into, there's an armed officer. There are state police officers trained to detect it, and there are federal agents, and yet we still have not been able to eradicate the drug epidemic. In fact, what we've seen is the rise of the prison state. We've seen the rise of the police state, the war on drugs by the number. So every 25 seconds in America, someone is arrested for drug possession. The number of those arrested for possession has tripled since 1980, reaching 1.3 million arrests per year in 2015, 6 times the number of arrests for drug sales. 1/5 of the incarcerated, 456,000 individuals are serving for a drug charge. Another 1.15 million are serving probation or parole for drug crimes. Incarceration has had a negligible effect on public safety. Crime rates have trended downward since 1990s, and research attributes 75 to 100% of those reductions to factors other than incarceration. So bottom line, we are throwing people in prisons left and right, and it's simply not stopping drug addiction and drug abuse. And that's credit goes to Center for American Progress for putting those statistics together. Number 4 and 5. So again, going through my 8 laws of drug abuse and drug addiction and the wars on drugs. Manufacturing and innovation is constant, and globalization plays a key role. I want you to consider here 3 primary drugs: opiates, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Opiates ultimately originated in the Middle East, 3400 BC or so. They then made their leap into the Islamic world. They then made their way into China, and ultimately Chinese immigrants brought opium into the United States, began popularizing opium dens, which were just sort of curiosities in the late 1800s in the United States. They weren't necessarily regarded in any, you can just imagine if you saw an opium den somewhere in the United States today, that'd be front page news if police discovered that kind of thing. But in the late 1800s, it was considered fairly routine. It was not anything out of the ordinary if you had communities where there were large numbers of Chinese immigrants. In the United States, opium became heroin, and then we later saw oxycodone come around, and so that was pharmaceutically derived drug from opium. And today we're seeing synthetics and fentanyl, again, coming from China. And the point I'm trying to make is that manufacturing of drugs and innovation of drugs is continuous. We constantly see new drugs come about. We constantly see new materials. The synthetics is really a frightening phenomenon. And because it's so hard to stop, it's one thing to go after a plant that's only grown in a certain number of communities in the world. It's quite another to go after something that can be made in labs. We also see, though, globalization. We see the Mexican drug cartels in the United States pushing out products that come from chemical manufacturers in China, and they push them down into each and every community. Cocaine, South American coca plant used by native tribes for at least a millennia, adopted and taxed by the Spaniards, chemically isolated in labs in the 1850s, and used widely for medicinal purposes. Used in minute amounts in Coca-Cola, abused all over the United States. In the 1970s, freebase crack method exploded into America. Again, another example of how manufacturing, innovation, and globalization all work hand in hand to create new means and new methods for people to abuse drugs, and new means and new ways for people to get around existing prohibitions, existing laws. Meth and amphetamines discovered. So first on meth, amphetamines were discovered before methamphetamine. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887 in Germany by a Romanian chemist. Shortly after that, methamphetamine was synthesized from ephedrine in 1893 by a Japanese chemist. 1919, methamphetamine hydrochloride was synthesized by a pharmacologist named Akira Ogata via reduction of ephedrine using red phosphorus and iodine. Well, what is ephedrine? Ephedrine in its national form known as Mohong, and it's a product used in traditional Chinese medicine. It's been documented in China since the Han Dynasty, all the way back 206 years before Christ. And I'm not expecting you to remember all this, but the point I'm trying to make in all this is it's amazing to me how I can be sitting in rural Eastern Kentucky. I can go into a court in Breathitt County or Wolfe County or Leslie County, wherever the case may be, and I'm dealing with people who have never been to China. I've never been to China, but yet I'm fighting drugs that originated in places like China and Japan and Germany that date back centuries and even millennia. And the point of all that is that we see manufacturing and innovation constantly, and globalization plays a key role in abuse. Methamphetamine and amphetamines were both widely used by Allies and Axis soldiers in World War II. Some people have even made an argument that Adolf Hitler may have been hooked on methamphetamine. Motorcycle gangs in the United States spread them in the 60s and 70s. They jumped to a lot of different groups after that. And somewhere along the way, they jumped into Eastern Kentucky, because when I first began practicing law in 2002, one of the first cases that I had was a manufacturing meth case. And back then, they were when they were using labs to manufacture. It was actual manufacture of substances. Now it's one-stop labs, and it's totally different. Or if it's even labs nowadays, it seems like it's various gangs bringing it in from Mexico and pushing it down into these very rural communities. Jumped mainstream thanks to clandestine labs, altering cold remedies, and just when you think that you've stopped it, you limit people's ability to get Sudafed, you limit people's ability to get pseudoephedrine, then they find new methods. Innovation and manufacturing is constant. And again, globalization plays a key role. Moving on down the list, law number 6, the Native American experience is a reminder that drug abuse and drug addiction does not hit everyone the same. And I want to talk about two particular constituencies here, African Americans and Appalachian Americans. And I'm not going to focus too much on Appalachian folk today, because I'm going to talk about that later down the road in this class, but I am going to spend a little bit of time on African Americans. So what we see in the war on drugs are huge racial disparities. Blacks make up nearly 30% of all drug-related arrests, despite accounting for only 12.5% of all substance users. Nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses than whites, despite equal substance abuse rates. Nearly 80% of the people serving time for a federal drug offense, Black or Latino. In state prisons, people of color make up 60% of those serving time for drug charges. In the federal system, the average Black defendant convicted of drug offenses serves nearly the same time, roughly 58.7 months. So that's almost 5 years and 8 months. No, almost 5 years. I'm sorry, my math's off. As a white defendant would for a violent crime sentence. Prosecutors 2 times more likely to pursue mandatory minimum sentence for a Black defendant than whites and blacks. Whites are less likely to receive relief from mandatory minimums. Sorry, blacks are less likely to receive the relief from mandatory minimums. On average, defendants subject to mandatory minimums spend 5 times longer in prison than those convicted of other offenses. Now, a lot of that is, in fact, I guess a great majority of that is not willful. It's not as if someone's saying, I have an African-American defendant and I really want to throw the book at them, but it's the way these laws ultimately come to us, penalizing heroin more than oxycodone, for example, which is we're beginning to phase that out and treat heroin the same as oxycodone. But then again, you see this resurgence in state courts where we're penalizing heroin more heavy. And of course, heroin, if you're in urban areas, more easy to get to, more likely to be African Americans trafficking it. But we have seen huge disparities because of the way these laws have unfolded against African Americans relative to white Americans. Appalachians and opiates. I just want to mention two phrases that many of you may be familiar with. A lot of people called opiates hillbilly heroin. We had the Florida pipeline, and we saw a huge proliferation of oxycodone in Eastern Kentucky and in West Virginia. And we're going to spend some time talking about that in the next couple of classes. Law number 7, the private sector. So drugs are a huge business. Stopping the supply of drugs is nearly impossible. And it's nearly impossible because the private sector is as resourceful, if not more resourceful, than the federal government and state government and law enforcement is. We see dealers, we see traffickers, we see gangs, we see smugglers, we even see doctors and pharmacies either legally or illegally becoming pawns in this trade. And so the private sector is critical. What is it that they're making? What is it that they're doing? You can bet that they're going to have a say in the war on drugs. It's not simply law enforcement says we're going to ban this substance and we're going to make this substance highly illegal and it's going to end. People are constantly finding loopholes. On the other hand, in the private sector, we're seeing a real growth in the private sector fighting drug addiction. We see clinics, we see doctors, we see lawyers, we see community organizations, we see organizations like Addiction Recovery Care stepping up and saying, look, hey, the federal government, the state government, we applaud you maybe for what you're trying to do. We appreciate you trying to make this issue better, but we have something that we can add to the mix, and we can do this in a way that really helps you accomplish what it is you're trying to do, which is make fewer people addicted to controlled substances, make fewer people, see fewer people's lives destroyed by addiction. Finally, law number 8, moral activists and moral activism. Activism for strict drug wars. We talked a lot about the activists in Prohibition. We saw activists like Carry Nation. After that, we saw lobbying groups. I talked about Wayne Wheeler in my last episode, and Wayne Wheeler, of course, is one of the people critical in the passage of Prohibition. He did that by perfecting political methods that promoted the draconian sentencing for alcohol-related offenses. Well, after Wayne Wheeler, you had various organizations had to successfully lobby to create these very large bureaucracies to fight crime, to fight drugs. The war on crime and the war on drugs are products of moral activism. And so people become disgusted by the spread of abuse and addiction, and they lobby the governments, they lobby state governments, they lobby federal governments, they lobby local governments to step in. Some of you may have been in jurisdictions where maybe one judge was very liberal and didn't go after drug dealers the way a subsequent judge would. I've seen that happen over the years. You see a new judge get elected, and the new judge is elected to clean things up. And so suddenly sentencings are much more difficult, and nobody's getting probated, and nobody's getting out on bond. And so you see that is a byproduct of the moral activism of people becoming frustrated and disgusted with addiction and abuse, and rightfully so. But again, what we're talking about here is the fact that throwing people in jail and incarcerating people just isn't enough to ultimately change the trajectory of drug abuse. The machinery of government eventually took on a life of its own and allows constant tweaks and upgrade as the mood changes and new drugs emerge. I'm glad to say that something I see today is I see activism for people getting rehab, getting treatment, has grown to the point where more and more judges are considering rehabs as a principal weapon in the war on addiction in a way that we did not see when I first started practicing law back in 2002. So that's activism for the smarter war on drugs, evangelicals, recovery communities, second chance people. You also see something that's emerging. You may not see it a lot in these rural areas, but African American organizations have just been horrified by the draconian impacts of drug laws on their communities, and they're beginning to push both the federal government and state governments and even local governments to do things a little differently so that their people aren't locked up disproportionately for drug abuse. So an assignment, if you really want to learn a little more about prohibition, here's a good video. The video's name is Banning Alcohol is a Bad Idea, Rod Phillips on YouTube. You don't necessarily have to agree with his ultimate conclusion to get something out of this. It's a good, I think, about 10-minute take on prohibition. So that brings us back to the beginning and the 8 laws. And I believe that this is a good rubric for us to understand both for now and the past and the future. And so I'm going to constantly keep going back to these over the next couple classes and talking about these because I think they work. So thank you for your time today. I'll put your assignments on Moodle. And if you have any questions, please email me, jonathan.gay@arccenters.com. You also should have access to my cell phone. And I'm going to stop sharing. And that'll be the end. Thank you.